creatures on the roof, visions of your own death, and monsters in the mountains. Today's episode of Darkness Prevails is packed full of creepy goodness that will surely have you scared and ready to stay up all night. Enjoy these stories, and be sure to send us your own at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear some alone at night stories and tales from security guards. Now, let's begin. Stalked by an invisible creature. From Swamp Dweller himself. This guy is a talented narrator. I'll link to his channel in the description. I grew up in rural areas my entire life, whether it was beef farms in Tennessee or living in the middle of nowhere, Florida. I've done it all, growing up without access to most commonalities we have grown accustomed to. Yeah, that's right. We had no internet, no TV, and yep, you guessed it, no cell phones. I know, the horror, right? I like to think of us as the last true generation before the internet age. Not to say dial-up wasn't around, but most of us at the time really didn't have access to it. But honestly, it really wasn't all that bad, outside of the long, boring summer days where we'd be cooking alive in the fields. Living out in an old Civil War cabin in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee definitely shilled out some interesting experiences. This story is one of many I have to share. The story starts off like any other, really. It was a typical Friday night, and my brothers and I were home alone. Being as we didn't have much of anything to entertain ourselves with, we began playing manhunt in and around the house. Most of the time, we opted to stay indoors, as it was pitch black outside. For a bit more context, our cabin was situated on top of a rather steep hill that had a long, winding driveway running down it. Our cabin had a basement level, the main level where most of the house was, and the upstairs that only had my room. We also had a back deck that was situated about 10 to 12 feet in the air, if I had to guess. Anyway, back to the story at hand. It was pitch black outside, and going much further than our front porch at night wasn't really something anyone enjoyed doing out there. The game was fun, but was already getting pretty monotonous with the little room we had inside. At this point, I had the bright idea to wander off outside and hide on the roof to make the game more interesting. This would soon be one of my biggest regrets in life. At first, everything seemed fine. It was rather cold as it was nearing fall, and the weather was just starting to change. There was a slight breeze and the air was crisp and calming. After a few minutes of sitting up on the roof, though, something felt off. I had been practically mesmerized by the sound of crickets and cicadas. I realized, though, that all the noise had suddenly stopped. This to me seemed very odd, but at the same time, being as naive as I was at the time, I didn't realize this only meant something bad was going to happen. I sat there as still as possible for a moment, trying to listen as closely as I could. I just couldn't seem to hear anything, aside from the slight breeze through the leaves. Then, as quickly as the silence came, an eruption of noise came from the other end of the roof. For a bit more detail, we had a metal roof at the time, making it very easy to hear when things walk on the roof. It sounded like something had landed on the opposite end of the roof. I looked over, but could see nothing. This, of course, left me rather unnerved, and my first thought was to exit the situation. Before panicking fully, I remembered it could be my brothers messing with me, since surely they would have given up on looking for me by now. I opened up my window and called my brothers. They both ran up the stairs shouting and complaining that the roof was off limits. As my oldest brother got to me, I asked him if he had been messing with me and making noises on the roof. He, of course, denied this and wanted to come up and investigate. So he and I slowly made our way to the middle of the roof and listened for a moment. Everything went quiet around us as it had earlier. At this point, I was already on edge and ready to karate chop a demon in the neck if I had to. We hear what sounded like a pounding noise on the far end of the roof in the opposite direction of where we were standing. After what I think were 3 sets of 6 pounding noises, it charged us. Well, I think it did anyway. It sounded like hooves were running on the metal roof, but the only issue was we couldn't see a thing. The entire roof was clear, aside from us, that is. But somehow we were hearing these footsteps. It quickly approached us and began running circles around us. I held my arms out to try and see if I could feel anything, but I couldn't. The weirdest part of it all, though, was that I could feel the vibrations of the footsteps around us, but could not see or feel anything in the air. These footsteps circled us for what seemed like many minutes, but were probably no more than a minute or so at most. It suddenly stopped circling us, and we could hear the steps trail off the roof and disappear into thin air. We quickly ran inside and locked the windows and doors and huddled up inside, freaked the hell out. This is just one of the many creepy stories I have had in this cabin. My Unparents, from Trick 9. As a little kid, I lived in a 100-year-old house on the outskirts of a small town in the Midwest. I honestly loved living there. I made a lot of friends too. When I was in the 5th grade, my parents decided to sell the place and move away. That's when it all started. At the time, there was a slight recession on real estate, and it took over a year to find a buyer. In that time, I was plagued with nightmares. Like any kid, I had nightmares before, but once I heard the news that we were moving, the nightmares became worse than ever before. They were always of this old man and an old woman. I remember the old woman vividly. She was tall, thin. She wore a wedding gown or some kind of white dress, with a veil always covering her face. I'll never forget her face. She was wrinkled and had bushy gray eyebrows. Her eyes were piercing and her complexion gaunt. Her nose curved downward into a hook. The old man wasn't present in as many nightmares, but he usually wore overalls and was short and tubby. At first, their presence in my nightmares were ominous. I could have been dreaming about running through a field with my dog, when there she would be, standing there. As time went by, the dreams got more aggressive, and even repetitive. I remember vividly a dream where I was pushed out of the window of our 3rd-story attic. Of all the dreams I had, this one occurred most frequently. To spare the details of them, things happened to me in these dreams that any other 10-year-old boy couldn't imagine, even in his most sadistic nightmares. I complained about these dreams to my parents. They at first dismissed them, until I would wake up with bruises and cuts in awkward places around my body. Then I was taken to see a doctor. The doctor concluded that my wounds were self-inflicted. I had no memory and still have no memory of cutting myself or giving myself bruises. Eventually, these nightmares got so frequent, so terrifying, that I was afraid to sleep and would stay up days at a time. Eventually, the house was sold. I'll never forget the day we moved out. Everything was in boxes and was being carried out to our car. I was making one final sweep upstairs, while everyone scurried to get out the door. I went into the attic of our century-old house and scanned the room for anything left behind, until, out of the corner of my eye, camouflaged into the side of the wall, was an old-fashioned chest. I pulled it out from the rafters and onto the walkway in front of the window where I could see it. I opened it up, and inside were various mementos, one of which was an old black and white photograph of an old couple. One short, pudgy man and one tall, gaunt woman with a hooked nose. And under the photograph was a worn old wedding dress. I stood up, and a horrific feeling of déjà vu overwhelmed me, because now I was standing in the same spot where I'd been in my dreams before being thrown out the window. Behind me was the window. I stood up, a shiver going down my spine as if there was someone behind me. There was silence, and then I bolted down the stairs to rendezvous with my family, the photograph still in my hand. 11 years later, I went back to my hometown for a visit. I'd thought about that couple for some time on and off. To the people I've told it to, this story was the best ghost story they'd heard. Obviously, some of them were exaggerating from time to time, but what happened to me was true, and now I was determined to know more. After 11 years, still having the photograph, I took it to the town library with the hopes of finding any records of previous owners of the house, or who those people were. I was in luck. This old couple owned the house from the 1900s to the 1950s. Supposedly, from a death certificate, they had a son who died at 6 years old from a fall. From the third story of the house. From the window. They never had another child. From another death certificate, the old lady died of starvation in the attic, apparently. Perhaps she was wearing her old wedding gown when she died. Perhaps all the evil things that happened to me in my nightmares were simply them begging me not to leave. From the library, I went to visit that house. I knocked on the door and explained how I'd been feeling nostalgic and was just passing by. To my surprise, they invited me in briefly. Apparently, they had been renovating and wanted someone to see their progress, and I was happy to see the changes. As bizarre as it might seem, the house was built without a bathroom in it, and when we lived there, my dad renovated a bedroom to be a full bathroom. Coincidentally, the access to the attic is through the bathroom. So of course, when I asked to use the bathroom, I made one final trip to the attic alone. There were some new items being stored, but not much had changed. At first, I couldn't find the old chest, yet there it was. I pulled it out again and opened it. Everything was in its place. I took the old photo from my pocket, placing it back in the chest. Then I closed it and left. A Sentimental Mistake. From Heretotell. I live in the UK, in the West Midlands. I've never lived anywhere even close to rural woodlands, despite having a deep love for walking in nature. However, a few years ago, I dated a wonderful girl who lived in the countryside. In fact, when we were dating, she introduced me to this show. Never imagined I'd have my own story to tell, but here we are. Me and this girl, we'll call her Willow, we broke up a while back. Sadly, it was kind of messy, and now I really wish we could have stayed friends. I was a jerk, and pretty insensitive at the time. If you're wondering why this matters, here's why. She lived very close to a somewhat famous woodland called Cannock Chase. It's home to plenty of urban legends and tall tales. I never believed any of them, though. All my memories of the place were beautiful. When Willow and I would walk through it to get to a little pub near a road, or walk her dog, this sweet-as-can-be greyhound, or just walk and talk for hours, these were some of my best memories with her. And that's how I ended up having my encounter. It was only about a week ago, as of writing this. I'm still coming to grips with all of it. I had a day free, and thanks to the lockdown, I was really itching to get out, though not somewhere with many people. I'd been reminiscing about old times with my playlist, and decided going to Cannock Chase and rewalking some of the old routes me and Willow took would be a good idea. I wanted some fresh air, and to bask in some of the best memories. So that's what I did, and for the best part of a day it was wonderful. I could still remember the main trails like it was yesterday. I walked across this little stream where you have to hop on stepping stones to cross, and followed the main route for hours. I saw a few people walking dogs or biking, but for the most part, it was quiet. Just me, my music, and the old conversations me and Willow had all flooding back in my mind. That's when I got to an old pond we once walked to. It was pretty deep in and covered in a lime green surface layer. The weird thing is, it was still bright, probably about 4 p.m. at the time. I guess you get so used to scary stuff happening at night thanks to horror movies and stories that you never expect it to happen in broad daylight. I was miles away, sitting on a rock, skimming stones and wondering if things could ever be different, if I could somehow show her that I've changed and that we could be friends again. Then, out of nowhere, it hit me. The worst smell I've ever caught whiff of. It was so strong I choked and had to cover my mouth with my sleeve. At first, I assumed it was just gas from the pond that I had disturbed by skimming rocks, but then I realized the scent was coming from the woods behind me, not the pond. I decided it was time to leave, and I got up, following a steep path to get away from that area as quickly as I could. I don't know if it had been silent the whole time, or if it had suddenly dropped silent then, but I noticed that deep quiet right then and there. And the thing was, no matter how far I seemed to go, the smell stayed persistent. It was like a strong musk, kind of like dog urine, mixed with the classic rotting meat smell. The more I pushed up this steep path, the more out of breath I became, and the deeper I had to breathe in. God, I can still remember the taste it left in my mouth. I gagged a few times, and I was beginning to wonder if a nearby sewage pipe had burst or something. That's when the inevitable happened, and I threw up. At least I'd made it to the top of the hill. Now I could just follow the bike path and leave from the same entrance me and Willow used to use, through a car park and out onto a main road by a bridge. The trip out of the woods was uneventful, though the whole time it was uncomfortably quiet, and I couldn't shake that uneasy I'm being followed feeling. I must have looked back over my shoulder so many times I'm amazed I didn't sprain my neck. As I made it to the main road, and I crossed to the bridge, I felt safe again. I decided I'd go under the bridge and compose myself by the canal before going home. After all, I haven't long passed my driving test, and tackling the motorway slightly shaken and nauseous wouldn't have been a smart move. So I went and sat under the bridge, listening to music, trying to get my head straight. I must have sat there for about an hour, working my way through an album I'd always listened to when taking Willow's greyhound for a walk, letting my stomach settle. Then all at once, the scent came back. I thought I was going crazy at first. It was the exact same, though this time much, much stronger. The road nearby was quiet, as it was a Sunday afternoon, and so the only sounds were the gentle babbling of the canal and the horses in a nearby field who were, all of a sudden, going completely ballistic. As the smell grew stronger and stronger, the horses stopped making noise, and instead all seemed to bolt to the farthest end of the field. Then I heard a new sound, a heavy plop as something further down the canal hit the water. My head jolted in the direction, but it was too late. The fairly calm water was rippling like something huge had just dove in, but I didn't catch what. Ever the skeptic, my immediate thought was that one of the horses was freaked out by the smell and had jumped in. But the canal wasn't that deep that a whole horse could just vanish within it. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't want to know. I headed for the steps back up the road, but as I turned away from where the splash had happened, I heard another, fainter one, less like something dropping into the water, and more like something popping up and then right back down. Naturally, I spun around to look, and to my horror, I saw that the water was disrupted from a spot considerably closer than where the first splash had happened. That feeling of being watched had returned tenfold, and I got the strong impression to not turn my back on the water again. Slowly and very carefully, I backed toward the steps, my eyes trained on where I thought something was. It was hard to make out, but there was definitely something in there, something large, wide, just a shade paler than the murky water. I couldn't make much out. I didn't want to, but with every few steps I took in retreat, it seemed to move against the current towards me. I swear, it was the most intense minute or so of my life. As I reached the steps, I knew I had to make my break for it. I turned slightly and ran up. As soon as I made my move, I heard the water erupt, and I heard a ghastly panting, like that of a wheezing man. I even felt droplets of water flick against me as I hurtled up the steps into the bridge. Only when I made it to the top did I dare to glance back, only to see the water being distorted again and a long, slender limb slip back under. I didn't see enough to say much, but it looked like a really disproportionate human arm, almost gray in color, with extremely long fingers. I booked it out of there to my car, making it home in record time. It still messes with me that whatever tried to grab me and drag me down into the canal had followed me from deep within the woods, out into what I'd consider quite a pedestrian area in broad daylight. It was so unnatural, like nothing I've ever seen, and that gasping noise when it surfaced, I keep hearing it in my nightmares, like a mix between a drowning man and a low, snarling sound. Well, that's my story. It's left me shaken and extremely uncomfortable. I find myself questioning other tales now and wondering what else might be out there. To think I came so close to being a missing person case, it sends chills down my spine. Be careful around the woods and the canals. I don't know if that thing is still about, or if it was just a passing encounter, but keep your eyes open. If you smell that scent, trust me, you'd know if you do. Get away, but don't go straight home. If it could follow me from the pond to the bridge, it could end up following you where you live. Stay safe, everyone. Be careful out there, and remember, just because it's not dark doesn't mean there are no monsters watching you. I learned the hard way. Warning: the following story contains disturbing depictions of animal violence. There's Something in the Woods in regional New South Wales, from Hunter 89. Around 2012, my best friend and I were hiking through the woods of one of the local mountains late in the afternoon for some exercise and because we were bored as can be. Not much happened on the way up. A few kangaroos here and there, but not much else. Great view at the top. Good chill spot too. So after the sun went down, we got the flashlights and headlamps out, carefully making our way down the mountain towards town. Again, not a lot happened along the way back, aside from some odd noises, some excitable roos and other wildlife. About 3/4 of the way down, we stopped for a bit to rest, which in itself was odd, as we weren't all that tired out heading up the mountain, and we'd had plenty of rest at the summit. We both felt pretty drained though, but since our backpacks were lighter after consuming some of the supplies, it seemed a bit out of the ordinary. Then we noticed it. A dead silence up there. No nightlife, no nothing. No crickets, and even the roos weren't crashing about the area like they had been. Absolutely nothing. So we were understandably a bit weirded out, and decided we should quietly pick up the pace. As we made it to the bottom, it was like the sound had been turned back on or something, so we continued on our way, feeling normal again, having a yak about random crap and moving aside for the rare car. About another kilometer or two later, we started hearing some weird stuff, and we'd noticed that all the other sounds had once again stopped. This time, when I started to feel tired, my adrenaline started pumping instead, because I remembered it had happened before. And then that sound happened again, some kind of rasping, throaty roar in the distance. It came from ahead and to the right of the road in the woods. Danged if I know what it was, but I do know that that sound isn't achievable by a human. As we got closer, we could hear a lot of crashing noises in the area we'd originally heard the sound from, followed by that horrible sound again, and the sound of an animal in agony being cut short. From when we first heard it, up until that point, we had turned off our lights and were practically creeping along the road. But now, curiosity unfortunately got the better of us. We shone our torches over in the area those messed up sounds had been coming from. What we saw next nearly made me wimp out to the max, and if my best friend hadn't been there, I would have bolted back to town. However, despite our attempts to show the whole macho as always vibe, all we could do was ready our knives and stare uncomprehendingly at this thing that was staring right the heck back at us. To make matters pants-wreckingly worse, this gosh-danged thing had a dead, almost full-grown kangaroo in its mouth, or what was left of the roo anyway, since it seems like it was gutted alive and was still kinda twitching. Every instinct told me to run like a bat out of hell back to town, but thankfully, reason trumped my instincts, and I chose not to make any sudden moves, especially since I somehow knew that we wouldn't make it very far if either of us ran. For what felt like ages, it seemed to be watching us, as though deciding whether to drop its fresh kill in exchange for us, or not. But then it sort of hunched up and made a slightly muffled form of that sound it seemed to make, backing up a little and jumping over 5 meters up the darned cliff face behind it. It then made the noise again before jumping and climbing further up the cliff, and out of sight. It was big, with gray-white hair or fur, and it could stand on 2 legs when it needed to. It had freaky shaped but clearly powerful jaws and claws like darned hands. But worst of all were its eyes. I swear, those eyes, they looked like they were full of nothing more than hunger and hatred. Needless to say, I don't like going hiking at night anymore. Something is walking down the sidewalk and looking out my window. From Listener. My mother told this story to me not too long ago. She suspects that someone is stalking her, or something else. To this day, she still doesn't know what to believe, and I don't know what to believe either. This is her first time telling me this story, and it has scarred her ever since. This story will be told from her perspective. A long time ago, when I was about 20 or 22 years old, I had a big house with even bigger windows. This was a new home, because I had just moved away from my parents' house. The place didn't seem evil at first. I was that person who was easily drawn to the outside of an object rather than the inside. I called my 3 friends over, Sam, Sunny, and Ricky. We'd been friends ever since grade 1. We were one troublesome gang of kids back then. Teachers would get fed up with us, and even in middle school, Rick was sent to an alternative school. Anyway, I called my friends over and they all came fairly quickly. I didn't make any plans, so we all decided we would just chill out and play some games and talk. We loved talking. We loved talking so much that we would even cut each other off because our minds just kept giving us new things to talk about, and we couldn't help it. Sunny was sitting near a window watching cars speed by. Whenever she got tired of talking, she'd stare off into space. I was making my way upstairs. This house was 2 stories high, and when you walk up the first flight of stairs, high up on the wall there is one small window. When I finished walking up, the first room I walked into was unoccupied. I had already started putting junk in there, and the pile was rising up by the day. I continued walking, and I was now in the bedroom. And there I had one large bookshelf, 2 huge windows, and a bathroom as well. This place is so huge, I thought. Suddenly, the door behind me hit the wall. I turned, only to see Sam laughing her head off. Annoyed, I asked her why she was laughing. She tried to answer, but she had trouble trying to stifle her laughter between words. She was finally able to say, "Ricky and I were just looking up some monsters caught on camera on YouTube. We saw this thumbnail of a tall black figure just standing on a sidewalk watching through the screen. Then Ricky said that it was probably his dead uncle looking for someone because he wasn't buried correctly." Yikes, I thought. I didn't think that was funny, but Sam thought it was. Instead of laughing, I just warned her that what Ricky said was no laughing matter. Sam's whole expression changed from smiling to complete guilt. "Oh, sorry," she said. "I'll tell him that later on." Soon after, it was nighttime. Sam and Ricky had fallen asleep. It was only me and Sunny. Sunny was on her phone and I was on my bed, lying on my back facing the ceiling. The light was off and now the room was the darkest of the dark. There was no moon, so the only light I could see was the light coming from Sunny's phone. The large window was covered in blinds. That even made the room 10 times darker. Then Sunny asked me a question that made me sit up. "I wonder if we're gonna see him again," she said. She put her phone on a charger and turned in my direction. I couldn't see anything, and the only expression I guessed she was making was a blank one. "Who's him?" I asked. Sunny didn't talk for a moment. I thought she must have fallen asleep, but then she answered, "Oh, he will come. He comes every night. There's no stopping him. He stops at every house, every apartment. He will visit us tonight, no matter what." Weird, I say in my mind. After that, Sunny no longer said anything. Later on, I wake up, so apparently I slept some. And for some reason, the large window behind me was making me want to stand up and walk towards it. Half of me was saying obey, and half of me was trying to stay in bed. But I didn't want to sleep. I wanted to see what was outside the window. I knew it was a bad idea, but for some reason I ignored that and stood up. I silently opened the blinds. There was nothing on the sidewalk, just darkness. All through the 3 minutes I stood there looking out, only one car passed by. I finally convinced myself that nothing bad was outside, so I turned away. I had only halfway turned around when something caught my eye. I turned back and I saw something that scarred me forever. Right there was one tall black figure. It was the blackest thing, blacker than the shadows around it, tall and lanky. The arms almost touched the ground. It was hunched over, but what scared me the most were its giant white glowing eyes. They were the only things on it that weren't dark or black. It was looking at me, unblinking. Turn away, turn away, turn away, my mind begged. That's when the tall figure outside did the unpredictable. My jaw dropped when it started to wave at me. It waved. Why would a being so demonic in appearance wave at me like a friendly person? There was a sudden shuffling behind me. Sunny walked up beside me and said, "Say hello to it." That sounded like an order. I did as she told me to do. Hello, Sunny and I said in unison. The figure opened its mouth, filled with bright glowing white teeth, and I swear it spoke in a loud voice that seemed to echo off of everything. Hello, you two. Then it vanished, like it wasn't there at all. I couldn't believe it. Sunny had spoken to this thing. She looked at me and smiled, then went back to bed, and I was left there to question what I saw. As scary as it looked, maybe it wasn't evil. Maybe the figure just stopped by to say hello. Is there something else I don't know? Is it connected to Sunny somehow?